Today, we're going to continue our discussion on positive psychology with the focus on measuring strengths in today's lecture. So, first, I want to give an overview of what we've talked about so far. So, we started off talking about positive psychology. What is it? We learned that it came from the field of psychology, which has been focused on pathology. So, diagnosing people with abnormal psychology and with psychology that really highlights the negative aspects of humanity. But in this series, we're going to be talking mainly about the positive aspects with a focus on strengths and well beings. Then we talked about cultural perspectives, talking about collectivism and individualism with the East versus West. And we talked about cultural competence, so highlighting these cultural differences and making sure that we address them when, especially talking about negative psychology or like pathology and mental health. So we've seen this go wrong in a couple of ways. With the LGBT community, we have seen that, a lot of psychology, especially in the early or in the late 20th century, was focused on sort of pathologizing these guys and sort of saying like these people have something wrong with them when that might not necessarily be the case, and we need to take into account all these perspectives. And so today, with Lecture 3, we're going to be talking about how do we measure strengths. So what we're going to be talking about specifically today is first, I just want to go over the ICD, which is International Classification of Diseases. So anytime you go into a doctor's office, you're going to get one of these, an ICD diagnosis. And so this is just a way of categorizing every single disease that is present. And we also have the DSM, which is sort of the ICD, but for psychiatry, which is focused on classifying all the pathology or what can go wrong with your psychology. And so if you go to a psychiatrist's office, you're going to get a DSM. We're on DSM-5 now, so we're going to get a DSM-5 diagnosis. And this is things like ADHD, bipolar, major depressive disorder, and BPD. And so in the field of positive psychology, do we have something similar to these where we can measure strengths and we can classify strengths? Well, there's 3 classifications that we're going to talk about today, which is the Gallup-Clifton Strength Finder, the VIA classification of strength, and the Search Institute's 40 developmental assets. And then at the end of talking about all those, we're going to talk about well-being and how does that relate into the strengths. So first, I want to talk about the Gallup-Clifton Strength Finder. And so how they came up with this is that this is a test aimed at identifying your strengths. And so they developed this with the intention of finding out what is right with people. And so the idea is each person has talents, which are things that they are naturally predisposed to be good at. So you can even think in your everyday life, some people are talented at basketball. The first time they pick up a basketball, they're already good. So that's sort of what a talent is. And then a strength is taking that beyond. And so your talents are sort of like your base stats, and then your strengths are what over time you've developed to be really good at. And so here, when you take this test, you're going to get, it measures 34 themes of how you interact with life and how you sort of construct your reality. And so these themes are empirically based, meaning that they're, come off the shoulders of a lot of evidence and quality research. And they also have construct validity. And construct validity just makes sure that we're measuring what we actually want to be measuring. So this test does have construct validity. And so here I just have all 34 of the themes laid out, and they've sort of categorized them into subsections. So we have the executing subsection of themes, which has the achiever, the arranger, belief, consistency, deliberativeness, discipline, focus, responsibility, and a restorative theme. And under the influencing section, we have activator, command, communication, competition, maximizer, self-assurance, significance, and winning others over. In the relationship building, we have adaptability, developer, connectedness, empathy, harmony, includer, individualization, positivity, and relator. Under strategic thinking, we have analytical, context, futuristic, ideation, input, intellection, learner, and strategic. And so now we're going to move on to the VIA classifications of strengths. And this is another way of determining what strengths are and what strengths you in particular might have. So, the purpose of this test and why they made this test was to define strengths and to understand the highest potential that humans can have. And so this was really developed in the mind of youth programs. So figuring out how can we assess if youth programs are actually doing good things to these children, to these youth people? How do we know if they're actually helping to develop positive aspects or strengths? So in this test, there's 6 virtues and 24 strengths. And so if other people think about your strengths and what you're good at, there's going to be a 0.5 correlation between what other people think about your strengths and what strengths you actually get. So they're kind of related, but not 100%. And so all these virtues are related to life satisfaction, and they're correlated with life satisfaction. And so these 6 virtues didn't just pop out of nowhere. They came from factor analysis, which is determining the factors that go into a certain aspect. So here we're measuring strengths. So when we look at these strengths, are any of them correlated? Are there any factors of these 24 strengths? And yes, there are. They can group some of the strengths together and put them under a virtue, and which we'll see in a little bit. And they did that using factor analysis. So here we have the virtue of wisdom and knowledge, which encompasses the strengths of creativity, curiosity, judgment, love and perspective, and love of learning and perspective. And then we have the virtue of courage, which has bravery, perseverance, honesty, zest. Humanity, the virtue, has love, kindness, and social intelligence. Justice, the virtue, has leadership, framework, and teamwork. Temperance has the strengths, self-regulation, humility, forgiveness, and prudence. And transcendence has the strengths, spirituality, humor, hope, gratitude, appreciation of beauty, and excellence. And so these concepts didn't just come out of nowhere. There's actually a governing body that looks at all psychological tests, and they make sure that they are rigorous and they have a lot of evidence to support them. So when I was first learning about this, I didn't know about that. So I kind of just thought, oh, they just made up all of these concepts. But no, there's actually like a lot of research and a lot of science that goes into these. And so these are actually, grounded in a lot of research that has shown that these 6 virtues are what encompass these strengths. So now that was just an aside. Now we're going to go into look at the Search Institute's 40 developmental assets. So the focus of this test is to protect children and figuring out what characteristics create a thriving child, whereas one of them creates or predisposes a child to more negative outcomes. So when you take this test, you're going to see 8 thriving indicators, 5 developmental factors, and 24 risk-taking behaviors. And this test doesn't have as much psychometric, a research into how the test is actually performing as the other ones do. So that's just something to note. And so here we have some categories of things measured in this test. And so on the external side, does the child have support? Do they have support from their family, from their parents, from neighbors? Do they feel empowered, safe at home, safe at school? Do they meet or not meet, but do they abide by boundaries and expectations? And so how are the expectations and boundaries set in home and school? And do they use their time constructively? So do they have outside programs? Do they, do art programs? Do they hang out with their friends? Or are they just like playing video games or looking at an iPad? And sort of the internal assessment, so what's going on inside of them. Do they have a commitment to learning? Are they curious? Are they doing their homework? Do they like learning new things? Do they have positive values? Do they take responsibility for their actions? Do they focus on helping other people? Are they honest? Are they respectful? Do they have social competencies? Do they express their own feelings? Do they establish relationships? Are they able to say no when they don't want to do something? and there are positive ways to deal with the hardship that comes with life. And then do they have a positive identity? How do they measure their self-worth and all that stuff? And so here I just want to give you, now that we've looked at the strengths, and all of these you can take online. They're not all free, unfortunately, but if you're very interested, you can go online and take these tests and identify your own strengths so you can try and maximize them like Shane has. And so here's the story of Shane. So Shane took the Gallup's Clifton Strength Finder and he got the themes futuristic and maximizer. So he's always focused on the future, not always, but he has a strong focus on the future, and he's trying to maximize his life and the outcomes of certain things he's doing. And so on the VIA strength test, he got gratitude. So he took these three strengths that he had, and he's going to try and incorporate them into his life. So how's he going to do that? So for his futuristic theme, he goes on walks a lot, and so he's decided, I'm going to focus on the future. I'm going to think about my future life, and I'm going to sort of envision that. And that's what he does on his walks, and he's found that to be very beneficial for him. And that's, developing his strength. So for his maximizer theme, he's decided, okay, I want to get the best outcome in my work and my school and everything I do. But I've noticed a lot of people, they're really negative, and when I say my ideas that I have, they're like, oh, this is a stupid idea, this won't work. So he realized, okay, these people are being negative to my ideas, so I'm going to cut them out so I can really focus on maximizing my outcome. And so that's how he's played into his strength there. And then with gratitude, he's taken time to write notes. He's normally he normally shows a lot of gratitude, but especially on Fridays, he's decided to write thank you notes to everyone. And so these are some of the ways that you can play into your strengths and try and develop your strengths. But if we take, for instance, a different strength, so let's just go to, maybe you take this Gallup Clifton Strength Finder test and you get a theme of learner. Okay, so how can you increase your strength of learning? Maybe every time you go, get curious about something, instead of saying, oh, I'm curious, but I don't have time to go look it up now. Instead, every time you're curious about something, you just quickly take out your phone and look something up. Or you quickly ask ChatGPT to explain, that would be playing into your strength. And think about how much better your life could be if you start incorporating your strengths and you know, really start leaning into all the strengths, all the things you're naturally good at. So that's how Shane did it, and you can think of how can you do this too. So now it's important when we're talking about these tests. These tests were mainly developed for the West, specifically. This is a lot of scientists from America, but maybe this isn't the same. If a different culture takes this test, how's it going to be any different? Well, we know there's a lot of ways that can be different. So one of them is with construct equivalence. So as we talked about in the last lecture, this idea of wisdom can mean two different things for different people of different cultures, even though it's the same word, because it doesn't have the same concept or construct. So they did a test measuring people from the United States and Slovakia, and they realized people from the United States, they tend to think about wisdom as more of a cognitive aspect. Like, I have a lot of knowledge about things, I have a lot of wisdom. Whereas people from Slovakia, they were more like, okay, how can this person relate to his emotions? How can they relate to others? It was much more empathetic, and I'm focused on empathy for their construct of wisdom. So that's something you need to take into account, is construct equivalence. And then there's logistic equivalence. So we can think about idioms, in the English language. You could say I'm on cloud nine to mean I'm happy, have a lot of joy in my life. But if you translate that just directly to a different language, they're going to be like, what? You're on cloud nine? What does that mean? They have no idea, right? Because this doesn't literally mean what we want it to mean. So that's something that you can think about with linguistic equivalence. And then there's metric equivalence. So we can think about the Likert scale, which is just the scale from 1 to 10. So an example would be, how do you feel today? 1 to 10. Well, this metric isn't the same for all cultures or all people, because some cultures, they may be averse to the extremes. So, for them, maybe a 1 for them might be, oh, my uncle died. That's the only day they feel a 1 on the scale. Whereas some other cultures, they might be, more like, today's not the great day, but it's not, but I would still put it at 1. So they're more open to the extremes. So that's how a metric equivalence um, could play out. Whereas the same feeling for somebody, but they both rate differently on the scale. Maybe they're feeling super happy, one person puts 10, but the other person only puts an 8 just because of the cultural differences. And so now I'd like to talk a little bit about well being. And so we have sort of a subjective way of measuring well being, which is just how do you feel you're doing? And we have some objective measures. But so well being can really be thought of as 3 separate ideas, which is emotional well being. How do you feel on a certain day? What is your mood like? Psychological well being, do you have meaning in your life? Are you trying to grow? And then we have a social well being, what are your relationships with other people? But they did objective measures of well being. And so they found 6 factors, going back to the factor analysis, that are all components of well being, but they all are slightly different. They're correlated with each other, but they're each aspects of well being. So we have self acceptance, personal growth. You feel like you're trying to improve your life. Do you have a purpose in your life? Do you have an environmental mastery, meaning on the day to day, do you feel overwhelmed by your situation? Or are you able to keep up with everything going on? And are you able to manage it? Do you have autonomy? And how are your personal relationships like? Do you have strong personal relationships? And so these are the 6 measures of objective well being, which we'll talk about later in the series. And so looking forward to the next lecture. The next lecture is going to be focused a lot more on culture again, and we're going to be looking at the strength